Palestinians are legitimate targets for violence. At least that's how they've been categorized in much of Western news coverage, especially in the United States, a country that isn't simply complicit in the Israeli genocide of Palestinians, but is actively overseeing it through political support, through legal support, through providing the bullets and the bombs. But how exactly is that done? What is done in news coverage that offers Palestinians as a people against whom violence is not only legitimate, but even at times necessary?
The suffering we're seeing among innocent men, women, and children breaks my heart. The question is, what is to be done?
Welcome to the Occupation Style Guide, a series that looks at how we talk about the Israeli occupation of the Palestinians and the words we use when we do. It's very easy for us to focus on big headlines and appalling opinion pieces in the New York Times or the Atlantic and say, this is racist, this is dehumanizing. But to really understand how the dehumanization of Palestinians succeeds in making them into legitimate targets of Israeli and American violence, we have to look at the moralizing language in the reporting around it, and how that moralizing language gives us worthy and unworthy victims of violence and empathy. In January of this year, The Intercept released a study of the coverage around the Israeli war on Gaza in U.S. mainstream media, specifically looking at over 1,000 articles from the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Los Angeles Times over a 6-week period. The findings of that study are damning. As the Palestinian death toll mounted, the mention of Palestinians dropped. Emotional language like slaughter, horrific, and massacre were near exclusively reserved to describe violence against Israelis. And out of more than 1,100 articles looked at, only 2 headlines used children in the context of children in Gaza, of whom over 6,000 had been killed during those 6 weeks. Now, this type of moralizing language, meaning language that assigns moral gravity, urgency, and judgment to a type of violence, isn't accidental or coincidental. It's an editorial choice. Earlier this year, independent Canadian news media outlet The Breach revealed that the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, the CBC, makes the choice to use moralizing language for violence experienced by Israelis at the hands of Palestinian fighters because of a very strange and telling difference it has chosen to make between the type of violence experienced by Palestinians versus Israelis. According to CBC's Senior Manager of Journalistic Standards, Nancy Waugh, the key difference between what Israelis experienced on October 7th and what Palestinians have experienced since is that Palestinians are killed remotely, and somehow that is what makes over 30,000 dead Palestinians unworthy of having their deaths categorized as slaughter, as a massacre, as vicious. See the issue? There's nothing objective about this categorization of violence. In fact, it is thoroughly subjective and speaks more to how the CBC, like other news organizations that use similar moralizing language for Israelis and not Palestinians, views violence against Palestinians. And that is the most common way of dehumanizing people in mass culture. It's those small words we choose to use and not use that determine who is given humanity and who isn't, who is allowed to be killed and who isn't. And it's this language that renders Palestinians as legitimate targets for Israeli or American violence. And it's this language that makes Palestinians into 3 types of news subjects. First, they're made into pathetic victims. They either are collateral in a war between Israel and Hamas, or they're victims of unnamed violence that just falls from the sky. Here, we see the repeated use of humanitarian crisis. We see a lack of willingness to name who is responsible, not just for the direct violence, but also for the conditions on the ground. This removes the blame, especially narratively, from Israel and the United States. It also narratively condemns Palestinians to their condition as a normal state of affairs, as tragic as they may be. Second, Palestinians are made into untrustworthy narrators. Palestinians are not to be trusted with how they tell us their stories, what they witness, and what they experience. Their testimonies are questioned, presented with caveats, and predicated on the belief that Israel has a, quote, right to exist and has a right to defend itself. The language of Palestinians especially is scrutinized and narratively criminalized. Specifically, the language is presented as inherently violent. Martyrs, river to the sea, intifada, and even free Palestine. Third, Palestinians are made into secondary victims. Even when Palestinian loss and trauma have been recognized, they are situated in relation to the loss and trauma of Israelis on October 7th. We see this especially in the coverage of Israeli hostages, many of whom were soldiers, versus Palestinians. Whether they're being bombed, starved, or detained by Israel, Palestinian suffering is contextualized within the circumstances of October 7th, versus looking at their suffering and conditions of oppression over 75 years of occupation and ethnic cleansing. The bombing of Rafah on February 12th, in which at least 67 Palestinians were killed, took a back seat to the news of the rescue of 2 Israeli hostages. The bombings were called a raid, a term that also carries a sense of precision, strategy, and thus some justification. The Palestinian lives lost may be tragic in U.S. news, but that loss was secondary to the gain of 2 Israeli lives. Israelis are unworthy victims of violence, hence language used moralizes their deaths, moralizes about the killers. Palestinians are worthy victims of violence, evidenced by amoral language that presents their deaths as sterile and commonplace without assigning blame to culprits. There's a quiet expectation that, of course, Palestinians will experience violence. They're terrorists. They have a violent culture. They don't want peace with the Israelis. There isn't an expectation that Israelis will experience violence, even though they are participants in the daily violence of military occupation, apartheid, land theft, and ethnic cleansing. Thus, when Israelis are killed, it is horrific. It is a slaughter. It demands our empathy. And when Palestinians are killed, it is rendered the logical conclusion of their existence, as sad as it may be.